There comes a time in life when you stop and ask yourself quietly, what changed between me and my children? Not too long ago, you were the anchor in their world. You were the one who held them close during thunderstorms, the one who made the impossible happen even on an empty stomach or a sleepless night. You sacrificed birthdays, weekends, maybe even your career or health, and you did it without asking for much in return. But now, the calls are less frequent. Your advice is brushed aside. When you speak, they interrupt. When you need help, they're too busy. And when they visit, if they visit, you feel more like an afterthought than a parent. That quiet ache in your chest. You're not imagining it, and you're certainly not alone. Many older adults, mothers, fathers, grandparents find themselves facing this painful shift in their later years. It feels like the very people you poured your heart into now treat you like someone who's in the way. But here's the truth. Respect can't be demanded. It must be inspired. And the key to reclaiming that respect isn't through anger, guilt, or control. It's through calm strength, clear boundaries, and emotional independence. In this video, I want to walk you through a deeply honest conversation, one that comes from both experience and decades of working with older adults across the country. We'll explore powerful ways to restore your dignity, protect your peace, and rebuild a relationship of mutual respect with your grown children. And yes, it's possible no matter how far apart things feel right now. So if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, please stay with me until the end. This may be one of the most important talks we've ever had. And before we begin, please like this video, share it with someone you love, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss another empowering message like this again. The silent shift, when respect begins to fade. Let's begin by acknowledging something we rarely talk about. The relationship between a parent and an adult child is one of the most emotionally complex bonds in the world. Why? Because it's built on history, on expectation, on love that often feels one-sided as time goes on. You raised your children with tenderness, discipline, and endless sacrifice. But as they age and as you age, the roles start to reverse. And sometimes that reversal is not done with care. You may find yourself dismissed, treated as if you've outlived your usefulness. You may hear phrases like, "You wouldn't understand, Dad." "It's a different world now, Mom. Just let us handle it." The pain isn't just in the words, it's in the tone, it's in the body language, the avoidance, the eye rolls. This shift is subtle and it often happens over years, but it's real and it's deeply painful. Now, what's most important to understand is this. You didn't cause this, but how you respond now can make all the difference. According to research from the National Council on Aging NCOA, one of the most overlooked factors in intergenerational tension is the lack of boundaries and emotional communication. Many older adults don't express what they're feeling out of fear of pushing their children away. But what if the silence is doing more harm than speaking up ever could? The pleaser trap. Why saying yes can lead to disrespect. Let me tell you about Dorothy, a 74-year-old grandmother in Ohio. Dorothy babysat her grandkids every weekend, even when her knees hurt. She lent money quietly when her daughter needed help with rent. She even allowed her son to speak to her in a tone that made her heart sink just to avoid conflict. One day she told me, "I don't want to be a burden. I just want to keep the peace." But what Dorothy didn't realize was this. Every time she said yes when she meant no, she was teaching her children that her time and well-being didn't matter. She wasn't asking for respect, she was asking for approval, and approval is not the same as dignity. According to AARP's Guide to Healthy Relationships, after 60 older adults who routinely suppress their needs to maintain harmony, experience more isolation, more resentment, and more mental fatigue. Let me say this clearly. Saying no is not selfish. It's a sign of strength. If your body needs rest, say no. If you're uncomfortable with something, speak up. If your grandchild's school pickup conflicts with your doctor's appointment, reschedule the pickup, not the appointment. Because when you honor your limits, others begin to honor them too. Why arguing never works and what to do instead. Now I know what you're thinking, but I've tried setting boundaries, and they ignore me, or worse, they get angry. That brings us to the next hard truth. Arguing rarely restores respect. If anything, it tends to make the situation worse. You raise your voice, they roll their eyes, you remind them of everything you've done, they accuse you of being dramatic, and the conversation spirals until both sides walk away hurt and nothing changes. Let's consider Mr. Paulson, a retired accountant from Denver. He once told me every time I tried to stand up for myself, it turned into a shouting match. I hated who I became in those moments. Eventually, Paulson took a different route. He stopped trying to win the argument. Instead, he simply stated his boundary calmly, clearly, and with no drama. When his daughter snapped at him at dinner, he said gently, "I'm happy to continue this meal, but only if we speak to each other with kindness." Then he stood up and walked to the other room. No yelling, no lecture, just dignity in action. And here's what happened. His daughter apologized later that night. Why? Because calm strength is magnetic. It doesn't demand respect. It earns it quietly but powerfully. This approach, supported by guidance from the Harvard Health Publishing's Healthy Aging program, is called responsive emotional modeling. You become the mirror they didn't know they needed. Emotional independence. Why your children can't be your whole world. There's a quiet expectation many parents carry into old age, though few speak of it aloud. That after all the years of raising our children, of giving everything, of standing behind them through every fall and every victory, they'll give back in kind. They'll call often. They'll visit frequently. They'll remember birthdays. They'll check in on your health, your emotions, your peace of mind. But reality doesn't always match that dream. And when it doesn't, when the phone doesn't ring, when they forget to say thank you, it can feel like betrayal. But let me offer you a reframe that could lift the weight from your chest. Your children are not responsible for your emotional fulfillment, and that doesn't make them heartless. It makes them human. And it reminds us that our emotional well-being must come from within. Let me tell you about Helen, a retired nurse in her late 60s. After her husband passed, Helen devoted herself entirely to her grown children. She called every day, cooked meals and left them on the porch, sent texts, photos, cards, anything to stay connected. But the more she reached out, the more distant they seemed to grow. "I just wanted them to know I still mattered," she told me with tears in her eyes. But what Helen didn't realize is this: when our happiness depends solely on someone else, we place a weight on them that becomes too heavy to carry. That's when she did something brave. She joined a book club. She took a watercolor class. She started gardening again, growing tomatoes and sunflowers in raised beds her husband once built. And something remarkable happened. Her children began to call, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity. They wanted to hear about her life, about the painting she sold at the church fundraiser, about the recipe she shared in the community newsletter. Because suddenly Helen wasn't chasing their attention, she was attracting it. That's the quiet magic of emotional independence. And according to the National Institute on Aging Older Adults who pursue personal purpose outside their family circle, experience greater self-esteem, improved mental clarity, and longer, more fulfilling lives. Your life should never shrink to fit within the boundaries of your children's calendars. You have a right to your own rhythm, your own passions, your own joy. When you live with emotional wholeness, you stop waiting by the phone, and you start answering your own call. Boundaries that build connection, not distance. Now let's talk about something that makes many seniors uncomfortable: setting boundaries. To some, the word boundary sounds cold, like a wall, like shutting people out. But healthy boundaries aren't about separation, they're about clarity. They teach others, especially your children, how to treat you. Let me introduce you to Robert, a retired engineer in his early 80s, a quiet man with sharp eyes and a soft voice. For years, his adult children treated him like an old relic. They interrupted him mid-sentence, laughed off his advice, treated his home like a storage unit, coming and going as they pleased. He'd never said a word, until one evening at dinner his son snapped at him over a harmless story from the past. The room fell silent, but Robert didn't yell. He didn't slam his fork down. He simply looked up and said, "You don't have to agree with me, but I expect to be spoken to with respect. If that's not possible, I'll excuse myself from this table." And then he waited. That silence. It was powerful. That moment, it changed everything. Robert didn't threaten. He didn't scold. He simply set a clear standard with love and calm. And over time, his children adjusted. Because when you respect yourself enough to communicate your limits, others begin to meet you there. The Cleveland Clinic has published several studies showing that when older adults assert themselves in calm, firm ways, family dynamics improve significantly, especially among multi-generational households. So what might boundaries look like in real life? It might be saying, "I'm not comfortable with that tone, let's continue this later." Or, "I'm happy to help, but I'll need more notice next time." Or even, "I love being involved, but I also need time for myself." You don't need to yell. You don't need to justify. You simply need to be clear, calm, and consistent. Boundaries aren't harsh, they're healing. They show your children that your time, energy, and presence are not infinite. They are valuable. Giving without losing yourself. You've probably heard this phrase before: it's better to give than to receive. And in many ways, that's true. Giving is generous. It's meaningful. It's a form of love. But if you give endlessly without boundaries or acknowledgement, something dangerous happens. You become invisible. That's what happened to George, a father of 3 from Arizona. George was always the helper. He'd fix broken sinks, walk the dog when they were out of town, lend money even when it stretched his budget. But after a minor surgery at 72, none of his children came to check on him. Not one. They were busy. They didn't want to bother him. They assumed he'd be fine. And that moment broke something inside him. Not his heart, his pattern. From then on, George made a quiet shift. He didn't stop helping. He just stopped doing it automatically. He said things like, "I'd love to help you move, but I have a commitment that day." Or, "I can babysit, but only if I'm feeling rested." And at first, his kids were confused, then surprised, then grateful, because the help wasn't expected anymore. It was valued. This echoes findings from Everyday Health Senior Behavior Study, which revealed that when older adults place boundaries around caregiving and support family members, begin to show increased empathy and appreciation. So no, you don't have to become hardened. You don't have to stop giving. But you do need to make sure that in the process of helping, you don't lose yourself. Because love without limits isn't love. It's exhaustion. Rebuilding respect. From the inside out. Let's pause for a moment and ask the question that sits quietly at the center of this entire conversation. How do you rebuild respect when you feel like you've already lost it? Is it even possible? The answer, thankfully, is yes. But here's the truth that many people overlook. Respect doesn't begin with what your children do or don't do. It begins with how you see yourself. If you walk into a room unsure of your worth, if you apologize for taking up space, if you speak softly because you think your opinion isn't relevant anymore, people, yes, even your family will mirror that belief. Let me tell you about Diana, a former school principal in her late 70s. In her professional life, she was a force of nature, firm but fair, respected by staff and students alike. But in retirement, she found herself shrinking. At family gatherings, she sat quietly in the corner. She never challenged the dismissive tone of her youngest son. She stopped offering advice, afraid it would be laughed at. And over time, the respect she once commanded seemed to fade entirely. Until one day during a quiet afternoon walk, Diana asked herself a powerful question. Why am I pretending to be less than I am? From that day on, she made a conscious decision to stop shrinking. She began speaking with clarity again. She offered her opinions without apology. She carried herself like someone who had wisdom worth sharing, not demanding to be heard, but expecting to be listened to. And it worked. The change wasn't dramatic, but it was consistent. Her children began to sit beside her, not just near her. They asked her advice. They began to reintroduce her to friends with words like, "This is my mom, she used to run a school," because Diana reawakened her own self-respect, and that reawakened something in her children. This is the heart of what the Senior Planet by AARP initiative teaches, that personal confidence in later life is not only possible, it's magnetic. When you carry yourself with quiet dignity, the people around you begin to notice. So if you're waiting for your children to treat you differently, start by treating yourself differently. Live like your presence matters. Because it does. Rediscovering joy beyond parenthood. Somewhere along the way, perhaps when the kids were little, perhaps when the grandkids came along, you put parts of yourself on hold. The painting you loved, the hikes you used to take, the late-night laughter with friends over coffee or cards, you pressed pause on all of it because you were busy, because they needed you, because you told yourself there would be time later. But now, after all that time, all that love, you stand here wondering what fills your days when your children don't. And that's where rediscovering joy becomes more than an act of self-care. It becomes an act of self-respect. Joy doesn't need to be grand or loud. It can be quiet, gentle, and deeply personal. It might look like joining a Tai Chi group at the community center, taking weekly watercolor classes with other seniors, hosting a Sunday brunch for friends you haven't seen in years, volunteering at the local library or hospital, or simply taking a solo walk every morning breathing in the sunrise. Let me share a story with you this time about Anthony, a retired firefighter from New Jersey. After retirement and after his wife passed, Anthony felt his life shrink to the four walls of his house. His children checked in occasionally, but mostly he passed the time watching television, eating frozen dinners, and missing the sound of laughter. Until a neighbor invited him to join a weekly storytelling circle at the senior center. He went reluctantly. But something happened in that circle. As he shared stories from his firehouse days, as others listened and laughed and nodded, he felt seen again. Not as someone's dad, not as a man waiting for a phone call, but as a human being with life still burning inside. That single group led to friendships. Those friendships led to travel. That travel led to energy. And that energy changed the way his children looked at him. They didn't just check in, they wanted to be part of his orbit again, because now their father was living. That's the gift of joy beyond parenthood. And it's one the Mayo Clinic Senior Health Division consistently emphasizes in their mental wellness research, that purposeful, self-directed activity in older adulthood correlates with increased happiness, better memory retention, and lower rates of depression. So ask yourself, what did you love before life got busy? What fills your spirit besides being needed? Because when your children see that you have a life of your own, they don't pull away. They're drawn back in. Final reflections. The quiet power of living with dignity. You've made it to the end of this conversation, but in truth, this is just the beginning of something bigger, because now the choice is yours. You can continue waiting for a call, for an apology for your children to come around, or you can start today right now with one small shift in how you carry yourself. Not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of peace. The peace of knowing that your worth isn't measured by who remembers your birthday, but by how fully you honor your voice. So here's what I want to leave you with. You are not invisible, you are not forgotten, and you are certainly not finished. You are a force, calm, wise, resilient, and the more you live from that truth, the more others will be reminded of it too. Let your children adjust. Let them catch up. Let them rediscover you, not the version who always said yes, but the one who stands tall, speaks clearly, and loves fully without losing herself. And if they still don't respond, love them anyway, but love yourself more. You are not here just to be someone's parent. You are here to live. So go live. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt dismissed or disrespected by your children? What helped you reclaim your peace or rebuild boundaries? Leave a comment below. Your story might be exactly what another parent or grandparent needs to hear today. And if this message has resonated with you, if it's lifted something heavy from your heart, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and don't forget to subscribe. Because here on this channel, we walk this path together, with dignity, with strength, and always with love. Until next time, take care of your heart and never stop standing tall.